So welcome everyone to today's ATN seminar. Our speaker today is Abby Hickok, who will be talking about using discrete Ollivier-Ricci curvature for point cloud visualization and geometric data analysis. The floor is yours.
Great, thank you. Thanks for inviting me to give a talk. I'm Abby Hickok. I'm a postdoc at Columbia. Today I'm going to be talking about two recent papers. So the first is called Recovering Manifold Structure Using Ollivier-Ricci Curvature. This was an iClear conference paper. It's in collaboration with Tristan Saidi and Andrew Blumberg. The second is under review but not public yet. It's called Provable Cluster Preserving Visualizations with Curvature-Based Stochastic Neighbor Embeddings, also in collaboration with Tristan Saidi and Andrew Blumberg again, and also Bastian Reich. And in both of these papers, we're dealing with the problem of high-dimensional noisy point cloud data, which is a common setting in modern data sets. High-dimensional data in general is difficult to visualize, it's difficult to cluster, it's difficult to do whatever sort of topological or geometric data analysis you might want to do with it. The approach that many algorithms take as a starting point is to build a nearest neighbor graph that sort of scaffolds your data. So this is, we start with a point cloud, we connect every point to each of its, say, k nearest neighbors or neighbors within some epsilon ball. And we use the information in this nearest neighbor graph to do lots of downstream geometric things. Like, for example, if I want to estimate geodesic distances, I can calculate shortest paths in this graph. And I can use information like that to get, say, low dimensional embeddings, like this embedding I have in the right here, where we're unfurling the Swiss roll. This is the classic example of nonlinear dimension reduction. This nearest neighbor graph approach, is leveraging the fact that locally we have this curved manifold, but locally it looks like Euclidean space. But in practice, this nearest neighbor graph approach runs into two main issues. So the first is shortcutting edges. So these are edges that connect points that are far apart in the manifold, or maybe even in disconnected components, but close with respect to Euclidean distance in the ambient space. So these cut through the ambient Euclidean space. The second problem is fragmentation of clusters. So this can happen, for example, due to like slight variations in sampling density, can lead downstream to large splitting of clusters in the underlying data space. So here I'm just showing, we have some toy examples on the left, noisy data in high dimensional space. And the right, I'm showing what happens when I apply a very popular nonlinear dimension reduction algorithm UMAP to this data, and we can see that UMAP is accidentally splitting apart that outer circle and also splitting that Swiss roll into two pieces by accident. So these are two common problems with high dimensional data. And so in our papers, we use discrete graph curvature to address both of these issues. So the first project that I'm going to talk about, this is the iClear paper. We developed an algorithm that we call ORC-ManL that uses discrete curvature, specifically Ollivier-Ricci curvature, of edges in the nearest neighbor graph to prune those shortcutting edges. And then in the second project, we address both of these issues, both shortcutting and fragmentation. So this is our algorithm EmbedOR, which is an algorithm for nonlinear dimension reduction for producing nice 2D visualizations of your data in a way that accounts for shortcutting edges of the ambient space and also discourages fragmentation of the ground truth clusters. So in part one of this talk, I'm going to define and give you some intuition for what Ollivier-Ricci curvature is. So Ollivier-Ricci curvature and discrete curvature in general is a function on the edges of a graph that assigns a curvature value to every edge in your graph. In this case, Ollivier-Ricci curvature takes values within -2 to 1. Negatively curved edges you should think of as looking like little bottlenecks in your graph, like on the left here. Positively curved edges, like on the right here, you should think of as connecting, points that are in like a highly connected community, or in the manifold case, maybe nearby in the manifold, sharing lots of neighbors. Formally, the definition is for every node in my graph, I consider its one hop neighborhood. So that's all its direct neighbors. So like for this node X here in pink, I'm showing its one hop neighborhood NX. For any given edge xy, I'm going to define two probability measures, mu x and mu y respectively, are the uniform probability measures on nx and ny. And then the Olivier-Ricci curvature of the edge is just 1 minus the one Wasserstein distance between those two probability measures. So this one Wasserstein distance is the average distance that mass has to move in some optimal transport plan. So here formally is the definition where we're minimizing over all possible couplings, which are these joint probability measures that have the correct marginals. I should mention also that there are like a lot of variations on Olivier-Ricci curvature. You can define the neighborhoods in different ways. You can define the measures in different ways. So this specifically is what I would call unweighted Olivier-Ricci curvature. And this is the version of Olivier-Ricci curvature, ORC, that we're going to use for the rest of the talk. So to give some examples, here's a simple example. I have just a line graph. My edge is xy here. In pink, I have the one-hop neighborhood of x. In green, I have the one-hop neighborhood of y. The ORC is 1 minus the Wasserstein distance between those two uniform measures. And here my optimal transport plan is I just take those pink nodes and I shift them both one over to the right. So my Wasserstein distance is 1. And so my ORC is 1 minus 1, 0 curvature. To see another 0 curvature example, just one dimension up in 2D. Again, in pink, I have the one-hop neighborhood of x, and green, I have the one-hop neighborhood of y. Here, the optimal transport plan is very similar. I just take those pink nodes, I shift them all one over to the right. So my Wasserstein distance is 1 here, and my Olivier-Ricci curvature, again, is 0. Okay, now to give a positive curvature example. Here I have this edge xy in a complete graph. These neighborhoods x and y are almost exactly the same, except that they don't include each other. So here, the optimal coupling is for every node that's shared between them, so not x or y itself, we just keep the mass where it is. And we move the mass at y to x and vice versa. So the Wasserstein distance here ends up being just 1 over n minus 1, where n is the number of nodes here. And so the Olivier-Ricci curvature is 1 minus 1 over n minus 1. So when n is large, this approaches 1, which is the highest possible value that this unweighted ORC can take on. Okay, now to give like a prototypical negative curvature example, here I have this little tree. I have my edge xy in the middle. Again, in green, I have the one-hop neighborhood of x. In pink, I have the one-hop neighborhood of y. For the sake of time, we're just going to we're assuming n and m are very large, and we're not going to calculate the Wasserstein distance between these two measures. We're going to calculate an approximation instead. So instead of looking at the Wasserstein distance between mu x and mu y, let's define this mu x hat and mu y hat to be the uniform measures on these nodes on the left, these nodes on the right, respectively. So just ignoring x and y themselves. And this makes it a lot easier because we want to calculate this Wasserstein distance. Well, every node ui is distance 3 from every node vj. So in any possible coupling, we're moving all of the mass distance 3, so the Wasserstein distance is 3 here. Great. And now this is the reason this is a good approximation to the Wasserstein distance that we're interested in. Is because, well, mu x is a good approximation to mu x, and mu y hat is a good approximation to mu y hat. So we can upper bound this by something very small when n and m are very large. So as n and m approach infinity, we can see that our Wasserstein distance between mu x, the uniform measure on the one-hop neighborhood of x, and mu y approaches 3 as the number of nodes increases to infinity. And so as the number of nodes gets large, the ORC approaches -2, which is the lowest possible value that it can take on. Okay, so to summarize, we have these like prototypical examples of Olivier-Ricci curvature. Key takeaways are that negative ORC edges tend to look like little bottlenecks in your graph. whereas positive ORC edges tend to connect nodes that are in like a highly connected little community. Okay, so that brings us to part 2, which is the actual research. So here, this is the iClear paper, Recovering Manifold Structure Using Ollivier-Ricci Curvature. So here, our algorithm, which we call ORC-ManL, short for Ollivier-Ricci Curvature-Based Manifold Learning, uses the fact that negative ORC edges tend to look like little bottlenecks in the graph. Here, our goal is to prune shortcutting edges in our nearest neighbor graph. And you'll notice here in this toy example where we have this little red edge, this is a shortcut edge bridging, far away points in the manifold. You'll see when you look at, the neighborhoods of these endpoints, it looks like a little bottleneck in our graph. So this is a good use case for ORC. So the first step of our algorithm is to identify these like candidate shortcut edges as those edges whose ORC values are a little bit below -1 plus a little fudge factor delta. And then the second step is to, rather than just removing all of these candidate edges and calling all of them shortcuts, because some of them are not, we have this validation step where we construct this intermediate graph G prime. We remove all these candidate edges that we identified in step 1. In this graph, we calculate for every candidate edge, we calculate the weighted shortest path in this intermediate graph, like this little blue path here in this little toy example. And then the validation part is if this graph distance in this intermediate graph really is very large, then we say, okay, yes, this really was a shortcutting edge. But sometimes this graph distance in this intermediate graph isn't that long at all. And then we say, okay, oops, this candidate edge actually was not a shortcutting edge, and so we don't remove it. This validation step prevents, so what can happen is because of like sampling variation, you can have little gaps in your manifold. Sometimes you have edges that cross that little gap. Those can have negative ORC, but they're not really shortcutting edges. That's what this validation step prevents. Okay, so we have a number of theorems that show that this process works well. So our first theorem says that Ollivier-Ricci curvature does a good job at identifying shortcutting edges. So remember in step 1, we're marking edges with ORC around -1 or below to be candidate shortcut edges. And this theorem says that when the noise is sufficiently small, the number of points is sufficiently large, we have that the ORC of every shortcutting edge is bounded above by -1 with high probability. And we confirm this empirically in a couple of like synthetic data sets. So here in this figure, we're showing 2 toy data sets, concentric circles and chain tori, like chained like this. And you can see that even for relatively like large amounts of noise, that the ORC of shortcutting edges in red here still tends to be negative and like something around -1 or below. And the non-shortcutting edges, which are edges that actually lie along the manifold, all tend to have positive ORC. Our second theorem says that we don't prune too many of the good edges, which are the edges that are actually along the manifold. So we want to prune our shortcutting edges, but make sure we're still leaving enough behind. We're still leaving behind enough good edges so that we're still like scaffolding our manifold nicely. So what this theorem says is that for any like fixed number of neighbors k, every point is connected to at least k neighbors with ORC equal to 1, highest possible value, with high probability as n goes to infinity. And what we show in this figure empirically here is that for varying numbers of nearest neighbors, k equals 2 through k equals 10, even we set the bar a little bit lower here and we look at the number of edges that are not necessarily +1 ORC, but just positive ORC, so things that are not getting pruned. We can see that a large percentage of nodes are connected to at least, a sufficient number of other nodes that have positive ORC. So we're not printing too many good edges in our algorithm. And then our third theorem is about the second validation step. So if you'll remember in step 2 of our algorithm, we have this validation step where we're removing candidate edges with low ORC. And we're looking at their graph distance in this intermediate graph. We're saying if that distance is very large, we confirm it as a shortcut. And so this third step says that the validation step works. So for all shortcutting edges, their graph distance in this intermediate graph G prime is sufficiently large that they're confirmed as shortcuts with high probability as n goes to infinity. Okay, and so when we look at it in practice on some synthetic data sets, it works very well. So here we have 5 different data sets. In red, you can see the shortcutting edges connecting points in different components of the manifold or far apart points in the manifold. The top row is the performance of ORC-ManL, our algorithm. In the top sub row, you can see the number of good edges removed, so 0. And in almost all of these data sets, we're removing close to 100% of the shortcutting edges. And then we're comparing to a number of different methods in the literature. I want to draw your attention also to the second row here, which is what happens if you don't have that second validation step and you just threshold based on ORC. So of course, if you just threshold based on ORC, you do just as good of a job at removing shortcut edges. But what happens is you remove many more of the good edges, which we would like to not do. So we see that that second validation step actually plays an important role at making sure that we're not over pruning. Okay, and then so this algorithm is a pruning algorithm for nearest neighbor graphs that allows you to do whatever algorithm you want to do afterwards. So we find that it generally improves downstream tasks. Like for example, if you want to do nonlinear dimension reduction or manifold learning, we find that using ORC-ManL, so that's the top row here, generally improves the low dimensional embedding that you get. So here we're looking at 2 toy data sets. On the left, a Swiss roll. On the right, a Swiss roll that has a hole in it. In the top row, you can generally see that using ORC-ManL as like a pre-processing pruning step makes it easier to fully unroll the Swiss roll successfully. For most of these are all very popular, like nonlinear dimension reduction algorithms. The only one where the performance is not so consistent is TSNE. Also improves intrinsic persistent homology calculations. So here what we're doing is, rather than using the ambient Euclidean distances for persistent homology, what we're doing is we're using estimated geodesic distances in the manifold for persistent homology. So when using ORC-ManL, what's going on here is you're building a nearest neighbor graph, you're pruning it, and you're calculating the lengths of weighted shortest paths in that prune graph to estimate geodesic distances, using that for persistent homology. And we're comparing that against just using the plain nearest neighbor graph with no pruning. So we have 2 data sets here. We have these 2 concentric circles, and we've added noise to this. And on the right, we have these changed tori. Again, we've added noise. So with ORC-ManL, with the concentric circles, we generally correctly pick up on the fact that there are 2 connected components in the manifold. These are 2 H0 classes. We also see these 2 more persistent H1 classes, which is correctly picking up on the fact that there are 2 H1 classes here. Compared to not doing this pre-processing step, it's really hard to see those 2 H1 classes. On the right here, again, when you use ORC-ManL as a pruning step, it's a lot easier to see that, here we have 2 components as compared to just 1 component without the pruning. Also, it's a lot easier to see. I don't know if it's hard to see. It's a little small, but there are two H1 classes up here and 2 a little bit farther below here. And this is reflected in the fact when we look at the distance between the persistence diagrams, the ORC-ManL version is closer to the ground truth. Also makes it easier to do to calculate various other geometric descriptors, like for example, scalar curvature and dimension estimations. So here we're looking at 2 data sets. We have on the left Swiss roll with noise added. We can see that when we try and estimate scalar curvature, the mean squared error is a lot lower here. We can get we get an estimate that's much closer to the correct answer of 0. Also for dimension estimation, we do a better job with that. And with the sphere data set as well, Our scalar curvature estimate is much closer to the correct answer of 2. And our dimension estimate is also a lot closer to the correct answer of 2. We also looked at some real world data sets. So here we're looking at a single cell RNA sequencing data set. So um, here we have a population of cells on the order of like 10,000. So every data point here corresponds to a cell. And for every point, we have this high dimensional vector where every dimension corresponds to a gene, and we're looking at gene expression levels of each gene for each cell. This is a motor cortex brain cell data set. And we can see here when we use ORC-ManL as a pre-processing step and then feed that into, here we're feeding it into isomap to get a low dimensional embedding. We can see we get like a better separation of ground truth clusters and also less like fragmentation compared to on the right here, we see this like neuronal cells, these inhibitory cells splitting. Okay, and this is just this is a very common benchmarking set used for single cell RNA sequencing data sets. This is the peripheral mononuclear blood cell data set. And we can see when we do ORC-ManL pruning and feed that into a spectral embedding, we get these much more separated, like compact clusters compared to not doing any pruning. Okay, just to summarize this first part of the talk, a lot of algorithms like TDA and general geometric data analysis start with the nearest neighbor graph. But these nearest neighbor graphs have this common problem that we get these short-cutting edges in red, connecting points that are close in Euclidean space, but not in the manifold. These short-cutting edges look like little bottlenecks in the graph, which is exactly what negative ORC detects. So our algorithm uses ORC to detect and prune these short-cutting edges. And doing this improves like a host of other things downstream. So now in the third and last part of this talk, I'm going to talk about how we built on this to produce really nice 2D visualizations of like high dimensional noisy data. So this paper is under review. Yeah, should be available on arXiv, I think by the end of August. This is also in collaboration with Tristan Seide, who's a grad student, Andrew Blumberg, and also now with Bastian. So ORC-ManL is really nice and it does a good job of pruning shortcut edges, but because the algorithm is using these two like binary thresholds, one on the ORC and one on those intermediate graph distances, what can happen when you're using a threshold is that you can like just barely miss some of the shortcutting edges. Either because the ORC was just a little bit too high for it to get pruned or because that graph distance was a little bit too short for it to get pruned. So if we miss too many of these shortcutting edges, suddenly those downstream tests don't work as well. So for example, if we're doing like nonlinear dimension reduction for visualization, I have some examples on the right here. So the left two columns are the data that these are just toy examples that we're looking at. And the right examples are what happen when we use ORC-ManL for pruning as a pre-processing step, and then we feed that to two popular nonlinear dimension reduction algorithms, UMAP and DSNE. And you can see that sometimes it does okay, like here, but sometimes we're either like splitting apart clusters or we're overlapping two parts in the manifold, or like here we have like a really high dimensional tree and we're totally splitting apart its branches. Those things can go really wrong. So this second algorithm, I think of this as like a continuous version of what we did before. So here what we're doing is we're assigning energy values to every edge as a continuous function of ORC. So we have this energy function, which we defined here. So the energy of an edge with curvature kappa, and we have this hyperparameter P, which controls the degree of repulsion. We have this function we have this energy function that decreases monotonically in the curvature kappa. On the right here, you can see like a plot of this energy function for various values of the hyperparameter P. Remember curvature is between -2 and 1 here. So as the curvature approaches -2, the energy goes up to infinity. And as the curvature approaches 1, the energy is equal to 1. And then what we do with these energy function is we use it to assign edge weights. So we use this energy as a multiplicative constant with the Euclidean distance between points. So we assign edge weights and we get this new weighted graph where what we're doing is we are lengthening edges. We're lengthening edges that have more negative ORC, and we're shrinking edges that have positive ORC. And so what this does, so now what we call our embedder metric is we assign these edge weights and then we calculate shortest weighted paths in these graphs to get a metric. So now what this is doing is, with ORC-ManL, what we were doing is we were pruning those negative edges that paths couldn't take those edges at all. Here, what we're doing is we're allowing shortest paths to take those negative curvature edges if they need to, but we're discouraging it because we're making those edges really long. And then what's also different from ORC-ManL here is that we're putting this metric into the stochastic neighbor embedding framework. So what this means is the stochastic neighbor embedding framework is a family of nonlinear dimension reduction algorithms that include like t-SNE and also more broadly UMAP. So what happens here is we define these high dimensional pairwise infinities between points where points have a higher affinity if they're closer with respect to this embedder metric that we defined. That's this delta epsilon term here. And then for every possible low dimensional embedding y, we define these low dimensional infinities Fij here, which are again higher the closer the points are in the embedding. And what embeddor does is that it optimizes a low dimensional embedding, specifically in 2D we're working with mainly here, so that the low dimensional affinities Fij preserve the high dimensional affinities. So we're putting this embedder metric that we made using ORC into this stochastic neighbor embedding framework. And the optimization problem that we solve is we minimize the cross entropy between these low dimensional affinities and these high dimension affinities. So again, these high dimensional affinities are fixed. They're just calculated with respect to the embedder metric. And then what we're optimizing is the embedding y. So these low dimensional affinities match the high dimensional affinities. You can think of this loss function of having two parts. The first part on the left is an attractive term that says for points that have high affinity in the high dimensional space, we want them to have high affinity in the low dimensional space. And the second part, weighted by lambda, says that this is the repulsive part that says if they're far apart in the high dimensional space, we also want them to be far apart in the low dimensional space. To solve this, we apply stochastic gradient descent. Like I said, we're splitting this into an attractive and a repulsive part. I'm skipping a lot of steps here, but at the end of the day, the solution to this optimization problem looks like what we get on the bottom here, where we're doing stochastic gradient descent using this attractive and repulsive term. And we have a few different theoretical results for our algorithm. So here we're building on a result for t-SNE, which says that if your data is really well behaved, so specifically if your data is spherical and well separated, which means your pairwise intra-cluster distances are small and your pairwise intercluster distances are large, informally, if your data is well behaved, then t-SNE can produce what I would describe as a cluster preserving visualization, or what they call a full visualization. The problem with this result, this is for t-SNE. The problem with this is that most real-world data sets are not well behaved. They're not spherical and well separated like this. So we can see on the right here 2 examples where we have these nested surfaces on the top, and TC just totally overlaps them in the embedding. And in the bottom, the same thing. We have these nested Swiss rolls, and those just get totally completed in the embedding. That's because these data sets don't satisfy the assumptions for this theorem. And what we show for the embedder metric is that these data sets don't satisfy the spherical and well separated condition for Euclidean distance, but they do for the embedder metric. So for our theorems, we use a model of a noisy data setting that's a little bit unconventional, that's convenient for our theoretical analysis. So we build what we call a noisy adjacency model. So here we're assuming that our points are drawn from a manifold without noise. We have these clusters or components of the manifold. We build an epsilon nearest neighbor graph where we assume epsilon is bigger than the distance between clusters with respect to Euclidean space. And then to model the noisy part, rather than add like ambient Gaussian noise or something like that, we randomly add edges to the graph according to a model where intercluster edges are more likely to occur between clusters that are close to each other than clusters that are farther apart from each other. Like I said, we use this model because it's just a little bit more convenient for our analysis, but it's also a pretty realistic model, and it produces graphs that look a lot like the nearest neighbor graphs that you get in the ambient noisy setting. So I'm just showing a few examples here on the right, where for each of these data sets on the left, we have a nearest neighbor graph produced from when we add like ambient noise to the coordinates of the points, and on the right, what happens in our like noisy adjacency model. You can see like the number of component bridging edges is similar, and those component bridging edges are like occurring in similar spots in the manifolds. So like qualitatively, our model produces graphs that look a lot like the more realistic noisy setting. Okay, yeah, technical aside done. First theorem shows that the embedder metric successfully shrinks intra-cluster distances. So this says that for points A, B in the same cluster, this embedder distance is sandwiched in between the geodesic-distance as an upper bound and something proportional to the Euclidean distance as a lower bound, with high probability as the number of points increases. So this is good. We're shrinking intra-cluster distances to make those nice compact clusters in the embedding. And we're lengthening intercluster distances so that we split apart those clusters in the embedding. So this theorem says that for A and B in different clusters, this embedder metric is larger than this energy constant. So this is the energy of a negative curvature edge. E is that hyperparameter. And CM here is the minimum distance between components of the manifold. Okay, great. Okay, and then our third theorem is basically a corollary of those previous two results plus the result for t-SNE. So this says that if we use t-SNE with the embedder metric, we get a nice cluster preserving visualization, which now I can define a little bit more precisely means that our embedding has a partition of points that correspond to the clusters or components in the manifold, such that the intra-cluster distances are significantly smaller than the inter-cluster distances. And you can see on the right here, so these are the data sets that like t-SNE struggled with. On the right here, we see t-SNE plus the embedder metric does a great job of separating these like two components in each data set. A really subtle point that I should make here is that t-SNE plus the embedder metric is actually slightly different than the embedder algorithm. So the embedder algorithm, the difference here is that the embedder algorithm is solving a slightly different optimization problem. But they're very similar. And this basically says that the embedder metric does a good job at separating clusters and a good job of getting like cohesion among the points within a cluster. Okay, and one thing that we also like about our algorithm is that not only does it produce like nice visualizations, but you can also identify like undesirable fragmentation within the embedding. So our theory says that edges with low embedder metric distance tend to connect nearby points on the manifold. So if you have 2 points that are far apart in the embedding that are connected by an edge that actually has low embedder metric distance, then this indicates that likely there was fragmentation of a cluster. So if you visualize all the edges that have low embedder metric distance, and you see, hey, there's this really long edge in the embedding that has low embedder metric distance, it's probably the result of fragmentation. So yeah, so let me give you some, and we kind of see this empirically too. So on the left, we're looking at a few synthetic data sets, circles and like a crescent moon data set. And when we look at the lowest and better metric length edges, we find that there are many fewer connected component bridging edges as compared to looking at all the edges in the graph. And the same thing when we look at a real world data set. So this is that same single cell RNA sequencing like benchmarking data set that I showed earlier. Here we have ground truth cell types, and we find that in general, like the low and better metric edges there are many fewer inter-cell type edges among the low and better metric edges than compared to like all the edges. So yeah, this embedder metric is like capturing something like biologically significant as well in practice. Okay, so an example in another nice benchmarking set, this is MNIST handwritten digits and fashion MNIST. So I'm just comparing here embeddor on the left with UMAP on the right. We can see, so in the left panel, we're just annotating with the ground truth clusters. The right-hand panel, I hope you can see this. We're showing all edges among the 33% lowest embeddor metric edges. So these are the edges that should connect points that are nearby in the manifold. And on UMAP, what you can see is that there are a lot of like pretty long edges in this visualization, especially between this orange cluster, which corresponds to handwritten digits 4, and down here corresponding to 1, and also between the 7s and the 1s. There are a lot of these like long edges in this visualization, which indicates like some fragmentation. And we can see this like quantitatively as well. So here we're looking at the edge lengths and the embedding of the low and better metric edges. So points connected by a low and better metric edge should have low distance in the embedding. Here we find that like embeddor does a lot better than UMAP, and is about tie with TSNE for MNIST, and for fashion MNIST, embeddor does a lot better. Here we have another single cell RNA sequencing data set. This is from the Schiebinger et al. Paper. Here we have, this is studying like a developmental process. So here we have for 36 different time steps, I think it is, we have a point cloud of like gene expression levels for each cell. And here we're comparing the embeddings of different nonlinear dimension reduction algorithms with embeddor. These points are colored on the left by the time step. So we should see like an ordering by time. And on the right, again, when I'm annotating by I'm showing the edges, the 33% lowest edges with respect to the embeddor metric. So these should connect points that are close in the manifold. And then we can see in like UMAP and TSNE and FATE, there are a lot of these long edges that should connect points that are close in the manifold. And we see this like quantitatively as well, that like the embedded lengths tend to be shorter compared to the other algorithms. We also see that embeddor does a really good job at preserving the time parameter in the embedding. So here, what's being shown in the table are the correlation coefficients between the embedded distance between points and their temporal difference, which is just the difference between the time steps. So generally, embeddor is like ordering these points better with respect to time. Okay, I have a couple more like sort of standard single cell RNA sequencing data sets where the takeaway is like more or less the same. So here we're looking at retinal cells. And again, we see like less fragmentation in the embedding as indicated when we look at the like embedding edge lengths of points that should be nearby. Also same thing here when we look at, this is another single cell RNA sequencing data set of chimp brain organoids. All the stochastic neighbor embedding algorithms up here do a pretty good job of separating out clusters, but EmbedOR generally does a better job at reducing like fragmentation. Okay, lastly, we have this like trajectory inference in a human forebrain data set. So here the embeddings are annotated with an estimated like RNA velocity vector field. And here we can see like UMAP introduces a lot of fragmentation. So this should be a continuous trajectory. UMAP like totally fragments this. TC also has some fragmentation. And embeddor does a pretty comparable job to Fate on the right here, which is great because Fate is like specifically designed for this task, whereas embeddor is supposed to be a general purpose like visualization algorithm. Okay, so yeah, to conclude here. Okay, I think like the main idea is that Ollivier-Ricci curvature is a good way to look at the local neighborhood of a point in your high dimensional data set, and look at how well does the Euclidean neighborhood reflect the structure of the local neighborhood in the manifold. Because we see that these like shortcutting edges bridging like distant parts of the manifold look like little bottlenecks, which is something that ORC is designed to pick up on. So our first algorithm use thresholds on ORC and graph distance to just prune shortcutting edges, which is a great pre-processing step for anything you might want to do downstream with a nearest neighbor graph. Like if you want to do persistent homology with like geodesic distances instead of Euclidean distance, or low dimensional embeddings or clusterings or whatever. And then embeddor builds on this by doing something like a continuous version of ORC-ManL in combination with the stochastic neighbor embedding framework to produce these like really nice 2D visualizations that highlight cluster structure, like UMAP, which is why everyone loves UMAP, but also introduces less fragmentation, which is an issue in a lot of these algorithms. Okay, so that's the end of my talk. Thanks for listening. Are there any questions?
First of all, thank you very much for this great talk. Let's all unmute and clap for a second. Very nice. So do we already have some audience questions? Please just raise your hand or unmute. Otherwise, I'm going to start with a short one based on the wonderful introduction to Ollivier-Ricci curvature that you gave. So is it possible to change the probability measures as well that are being used there? Would that make sense? Would that be useful for certain applications?
Yeah, totally. I know that I've seen it. So there's one nice application paper that uses ORC for community detection, using the same idea that if you have like a negative curvature edge, probably connects points in different communities. And I think they use a non-uniform measure on the nodes that puts, I think, more weight on nodes that are closer to the point and lower weight on points that are farther away.
Very, very nice. Thank you very much. Because yeah, no, I'm gonna hand over the to
yeah.
Henry.
So, or you can also use like a larger neighborhood again with like less weight on points that are farther away.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, gotcha. You could do it hop right and k-hop if you wanted to. Very nice. Right. Thank you for that. Like next, Henry.
Hey, thanks for the nice talk. This is sort of a hand wavy question, but you described this EmbedOR metric and the nice properties it has, like with respect to intra or inter-cluster distances. Do you think there's a sense in which you could look for like an optimum metric satisfying certain properties, like there might be EmbedOR or something similar? Is there some optimization problem that you're solving?
That's a good question. I think it depends on what you're trying to optimize for. So here, like, we're not necessarily trying to optimize for like getting the actual geodesic distance, but rather, getting a good visualization. So we really want to have points in different clusters repulsed from each other, and points in the same cluster like get pulled together. But
cool.
If you wanted a dimension reduction algorithm that like really preserved distances like isomap, that would be a different optimization problem.
Very nice. Do we have some other questions? If not, maybe I'm gonna oh, we have one. Yes, Pierre, please go ahead.
Yeah, I had a question. So I understand that you can prune edges, but what if you have like an outlier point that is in between the two shapes? Would the edge of the outlier points be detected as to be pruned edges, or how does it work in this case?
Yeah, in this case, if you had, like I'm imagining just like a couple outliers in between two components, that would probably, the incident edges would probably be, we detect those shortcuts.
Okay, thanks.
Right, we have a question in the chat by Maxime. Thank you for this amazing talk. Any particular intuition for the energy, or rather the curvature function that you are using?
Only that it's like, it has the properties we want, which is like it's monotonically decreasing. It's like asymptotic to infinity as we approach the lowest possible ORC value, and something constant when we approach the highest possible ORC value. And we have control over like how much repulsion and how much attraction that we have. And it kind of works in practice.
Very good. Does that answer your question, Maxime? Ah, yeah, okay, great. Awesome. Then another question by Michael. Do you have publicly available code?
For the pruning, yes, it's on GitHub. For the second one, not yet, but definitely like we will make the code public and hopefully easily installable when the paper is made public.
Nice. Thanks so much. Do we have any other questions from the audience at this point?
I saw Dave.
Yes, Dave.
Dave, go ahead.
Does it make a does this can be adapted to weighted graphs where you don't have an embedding? Here you're talking about embedded data.
Yes. Okay, so so definitely the pruning part would work just fine. For the embeddor, we're using the energy function of curvature as like a multiplicative constant with the Euclidean distance. So right in the setting that you're talking about, you wouldn't have a Euclidean distance.
Right.
What I would probably do in that setting is, assuming your weights represent, if your weights represent like a dissimilarity, I would just use those weights as the Euclidean distance instead. If the weights represent like similarity, meaning higher weight means weights that are more similar, then I would do something like invert the weights and treat that as your distances or something like that. But we have not done really any experiments like that.
No, that's good.
That's sort of my general approach to weighted graphs that aren't embedded, though.
Good. Thank you. Very nice talk.
Thanks.
Hi, Fabi. I also have a question. Thank you. It was a very lovely talk. Have you tested like how big the data set you can use? Like how many points? Maybe you say it and I skip it, but
yeah. Okay. So for ORC-ManL, the runtime is like comparable to UMAP. For EmbedOR, it scales decently well, and you can speed it up by using like landmark methods, which is similar to how like UMAP is optimized.
Okay, nice.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Awesome. Any other questions from the audience? Not maybe one quick one. I think you said it, but I might have not caught it in time. So all of this generalizes to higher dimensions, I guess, right? So basically, you don't really care about the dimension of the coordinates.
Yeah. So the data might be in like high dimensional embedding space.
Yeah.
But as long as it's on a reasonably lower dimensional manifold, it works nicely.
Yeah. So we basically have the standard manifold learning assumption. Sorry for cutting you off. Sorry.
I was going to say, when you get to very high dimensions, you do start to run into issues. So I do think there's like a somewhat open problem there. I think pruning, the higher the ambient dimension, the harder the pruning gets. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I guess at some point it becomes too problematic because of the distances.
Because everything is far apart. Yeah.
Yeah. Very nice.
Yeah.
Can't escape that.
You do end up there's a tendency to over-prune in very high dimensions.
Right. Thank you so much. So any other questions? If not, then
Yeah. Actually, I
yeah.
have a question. Hello.
Mhm.
Yeah, can ORS can be extended to the dynamic nature of data sets or time varying graphs, like time series data?
I guess it depends on what you mean by that. So we had the one time series, which was just a time sequence of point clouds that we used embeddor on, and it worked pretty well at like preserving that time coordinate. But if you mean, I guess if what you mean is a sequence of graphs, that might be a little bit harder. I guess I'm not exactly sure. Yeah, I guess I'm not exactly, maybe you could clarify exactly what you mean.
Not sure whether the
I don't know.
question got dropped. My
I'm not
impression.
sure. Yeah, we did have this one example where we had like a sequence of point clouds.
Yeah, my impression was whether it's possible to extend this to something that has a natural like time varying dimension. So suppose you have edge appearance times, right? Then how would you go about that? But
Yeah, I guess that's an interesting question. I mean, you could apply these algorithms like separately on each one, but it would be interesting to do something more interesting than that, to actually leverage the time information.
very nice, very exciting. All right. So any other questions? If not, thank you once again for the great talk, and I'm going to stop the recording now.